The sun rose slowly over the quiet ranch land, painting the sky with soft gold and pale orange. The air was still cool, the kind of cool that made the grass sparkle with dew and the horses' breaths visible like soft white clouds. A young woman named Clara walked along the wooden fence line that stretched across the field. She liked mornings like this, quiet, peaceful, and full of the promise of a simple day. Birds hopped between fence posts, and in the distance the cattle were beginning to stir. She had been helping around the ranch for only a few months. Most of her work involved caring for the horses, feeding them, and keeping the pasture clean. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and she liked that. She liked the rhythm of the land, the feeling of earth beneath her boots, and the way the wind brushed against her hair. This was the first place that had truly felt safe to her in a long time. The rancher, Ethan, was already out near the barn, checking the fences. He was a tall man with a quiet face, the kind of man who didn't talk much but always showed up when someone needed help. He had a steady way of moving, calm but alert, as if the land itself had taught him patience. Clara admired that about him. She had learned more from watching him work than from anything else. She waved to him from across the field, and he tipped his hat in return. It was an ordinary morning, one that felt like it would be gentle and uneventful. She was humming a small tune, leaning against the fence, when something unexpected cut through the air, a sharp whistling sound. She didn't have time to turn fully. Before she could even understand what had happened, a heavy, burning pressure struck her chest. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as her knees gave way. She looked down in disbelief and saw the iron shaft of an arrow buried deep in her. The sound of the world disappeared. There was only the pounding in her ears and the rush of air that refused to fill her lungs properly. She tried to take a step back, but her legs didn't obey. She collapsed onto the cold, dry earth, her hands clutching at the wound as if she could push the pain away. The rancher saw her fall from the other side of the pasture. For a moment he thought maybe she had tripped, but then he saw the flash of metal. His hat fell from his head as he sprinted across the field faster than he had in years. The horses startled, lifting their heads and stamping nervously, but he didn't stop to calm them. Every second mattered. When Ethan reached her side, she was lying on her back, her breath short and shaky. The arrow had entered just below her collarbone, and blood stained the front of her shirt. Her eyes were wide, full of shock and fear. She looked up at him, her lips trembling, but no words came out. Her hand reached toward him weakly, like she was reaching for something solid in a world that was suddenly spinning away. "Easy," he said softly, his voice steady even though his heart was racing. "I'm here." He knelt down beside her, pressing one hand around the wound to slow the bleeding. His hands were strong but careful. He didn't want to frighten her more. The arrow was old and rough, something likely from a hunting bow not made to be kind. It wasn't supposed to be there at all, not on a morning like this. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She tried to speak, tried to ask what happened, but every time she opened her mouth, only broken breaths came out. He leaned closer, trying to keep her calm. "Don't talk," he whispered. "Just breathe. Stay with me." Ethan's mind was spinning. The town was too far to get help in time. Even if he rode hard, she might not make it. He couldn't pull the arrow out without control, but leaving it in was dangerous too. He pressed his fingers gently near the wound and felt the way her chest trembled. She was still conscious, still fighting. He couldn't let her slip away. Around them, the ranch was silent. The wind moved slowly, carrying the smell of grass and dust. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried out. It was the kind of silence that made everything sharper. The sound of her breathing, the beat of his heart, the creak of the wood beneath their knees. He tore a strip from the edge of his shirt with his teeth and wrapped it carefully around the base of the arrow to keep the wound from spreading. She whimpered softly, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't pull away from his hands. Her world blurred in and out. Sometimes she saw the blue sky. Sometimes all she saw was the edge of his face, calm and focused, like an anchor in a storm. She felt his hands pressing down, keeping her from fading away. A warm trickle ran down her neck. She wasn't sure if it was blood or sweat. Ethan spoke to her in a low, steady voice. He told her to keep her eyes open. He told her she was safe now. He promised he wouldn't leave her. She blinked slowly, fighting to stay awake. She had never heard him say so many words at once before. It was strange, comforting, but also frightening. Then, as she shivered, she noticed something. His shirt was already soaked with her blood. It was pooling in the dirt beneath them, dark against the golden ground. Her heartbeat was uneven now, and the world seemed to sway gently, like a rocking boat. She could hear his breathing over hers, deep and controlled. He was trying to hold everything together. Ethan's thoughts were sharp. He scanned the field, looking for any sign of who or what had fired the arrow. He saw movement far off in the trees, like someone riding away quickly. It didn't matter right now. Finding them would not save her. His hands pressed harder against the wound. He could feel her trembling, but she was still breathing. He leaned down so she could hear him clearly. "You're going to be all right," he whispered. "Do you hear me? You're going to be all right." Her lips parted, and for the first time a faint sound came out. It was a weak, shaky yes. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. It was enough to keep him moving. He slid one arm gently behind her back to lift her just slightly, careful not to disturb the arrow. Her head fell against his shoulder, and she could hear the rhythm of his heartbeat against her ear. Strong, steady, and real. He held her like that for a moment, whispering soft words she barely understood. The sky grew brighter, but for the two of them, time felt frozen. She wasn't sure if it was minutes or seconds. The pain came in waves, sometimes sharp, sometimes distant, but she kept her eyes on his face. As long as she could see him, she felt like the world hadn't left her behind yet. In that moment, Ethan wasn't thinking about the fence he still had to fix or the horses that needed tending. All that mattered was keeping her alive. She was young, kind, and full of a quiet strength he'd noticed the first day she came to the ranch. She deserved more than to fade away in a field. The ranch was still empty around them, but a plan had already formed in his mind. He would do whatever it took to save her. If he had to use his bare hands to pull her back from the edge, he would. If he had to ride through the night, he would. There was no question. Clara clutched weakly at his sleeve, her fingers barely holding on. Her face was pale and her breaths were shallow, but there was still something in her eyes, something that refused to give up. He leaned closer, speaking softly again. "You're safe," he said. "I've got you." And in that quiet field beneath the wide sky, two lives had already changed. She had thought it was going to be just another morning. He had thought it would be another ordinary day of work. Neither of them had known that a single arrow would tie their lives together in a way neither could have imagined. The birds still sang softly in the distance, unaware of the storm that had just begun. But for Clara and Ethan, this was the beginning of something that would test their courage, their strength, and their bond in ways they could not yet understand. The wind blew gently across the field, carrying their breaths into the endless sky. She felt the warmth of his hand, steady and firm, holding her to life. And even in her pain, even as her tears fell silently, she believed him when he whispered that she would be all right. The air was growing warmer as the sun climbed higher, but Clara felt cold all over. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from wind or rain. It was the cold that came from fear. She lay against the earth, her breath still uneven, the world spinning slowly around her. She could hear distant birds and the rustle of leaves, but everything felt far away. The sound of Ethan's voice was the only thing that still seemed close. Ethan's hands were steady, but inside he was torn between panic and focus. He knew time was slipping away. Clara was losing blood fast, and the iron arrow was deep. Every second it stayed inside her chest was another second she grew weaker. He clenched his jaw, staring down at the wound, knowing what he had to do next. He had been on the ranch long enough to see bad accidents. He had seen men fall off horses. He had carried injured hands to the doctor. But this was different. This was more dangerous, more personal. Clara wasn't just some stranger who had wandered onto the land. She had become part of it. She worked hard every day, never complaining, always smiling softly even after long hours. And now, lying on the ground, her lips pale and her heartbeat faint, she was depending on him completely. "Stay with me," he whispered, brushing a stray strand of hair away from her damp forehead. "You hear me? Stay awake, Clara." Her eyes fluttered open. She looked up at him, her lashes wet with tears, and gave the smallest nod. It was a weak nod, but it meant she was still fighting. Ethan took a slow breath and glanced toward the old barn. There was no one else around to help. The nearest doctor lived at least 40 minutes away by horse if the ride was hard. She wouldn't make it that long without help. He looked at the arrow again. It was buried deep, the shaft sticking out like something that didn't belong in this peaceful morning. The metal was dark and old, not new like something used in sport. Someone must have been hunting on the edge of the property. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it wasn't. But those questions would have to wait. Right now there was only one thing he could do: get the arrow out before it caused more damage inside her chest. Ethan had seen enough wounds to know that pulling something like this out was dangerous, but leaving it in might be worse. Clara was already starting to shiver, and her skin had taken on that pale look that made his stomach twist. He carefully adjusted his position, moving closer to her head so she could see his face. He wanted her to see calm in his eyes even if his heart was racing. "Clara," he said softly, his voice low and sure, "listen to me carefully. The doctor's too far. If I don't get this arrow out, it's going to get worse fast. I won't lie to you. It's going to hurt." Her lips trembled, but she whispered back, "I trust you." Those 3 quiet words felt heavier than anything he had ever heard. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. She was placing her life entirely in his hands. He could not fail her. He untied the cloth around her wound to check how deep the arrow had gone. The edges of the injury were dark with dried blood, but fresh red still seeped slowly out. He didn't have medical tools, just what was around him. He reached into the small leather pouch he always carried on his belt. Inside was a short hunting knife, a clean cloth, and a flask of water. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He poured a little water around the wound to wash away the dirt. Clara winced and squeezed her eyes shut. He murmured softly, I know it hurts. Just breathe with me." The wind picked up gently, carrying the sound of rustling leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed nervously. Sensing the tension, Ethan steadied his breathing and placed one hand firmly on her shoulder to keep her still. His other hand carefully wrapped the cloth around the shaft of the arrow. "On 3, he whispered, but deep down he knew there was no perfect way to do this. Whether it was on 1, 2, or 3, it would hurt. What mattered was doing it fast and steady. Clara's chest rose and fell unevenly. Her hand reached up and grabbed his wrist, not to stop him, but to hold on to something real. Her grip was weak but desperate. She kept her eyes on his, and he forced a calm smile for her sake. 1, he said quietly. She squeezed his wrist harder. 2, a tear slipped down her cheek, and before 3 could leave his lips, he pulled. The sound was sharp and quiet at the same time, a soft, wet snap of iron sliding free from flesh. Clara screamed, but it wasn't the kind of scream that echoed. It was a short, broken cry that melted into gasping breaths. Her back arched off the ground for a second before falling against the dirt again. Ethan pressed down hard with the cloth, stopping the blood as fast as he could. He could feel his pulse in his hands. The arrow clattered to the ground beside them, stained dark. Clara's eyes were wide open, tears streaming freely now, but she was still breathing. Shallow, shaky breaths, but she was breathing. "It's out," he whispered quickly, his voice a mix of relief and urgency. "It's out, Clara, you're still here. Stay with me." Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She blinked slowly, focusing on his face. He worked fast, pressing the cloth down tightly, using all the strength he had to keep pressure on the wound. He tore another piece of his shirt to wrap it tighter, knotting it to keep the blood from soaking through too quickly. His heart was still pounding when he reached for his water flask and poured a little more on the edges of the wound. Clara whimpered softly but didn't fight him. Her face was wet with tears, her hair sticking to her forehead. Her breaths were uneven, but something in her eyes had shifted. The panic was slowly giving way to exhaustion. Then, as Ethan leaned back to catch his breath, something strange happened. Clara's gaze, though blurry, moved down toward his side. Her brow furrowed. She lifted a trembling hand and pointed weakly. At first he thought she was just disoriented. But then he looked down. The sleeve of his shirt was stained red, not from her wound, but from his arm. When he had pulled the arrow out, the sharp edges had sliced deep across his forearm. He hadn't even felt it in the moment, too focused on saving her. Now the blood ran down slowly, dripping into the dirt beneath them. Clara tried to speak, but her voice was no more than a whisper. "You're bleeding," she managed to say. Ethan looked at the wound and then back at her pale face. He didn't care about himself at that moment. His injury was nothing compared to what she was going through. But the pain began to throb now that he noticed it. He took a slow breath, tightening his jaw. "Don't worry about me," he said quietly. "I'll be fine. You're the one that matters right now." Her eyes filled with tears again, but not from pain this time. She reached weakly toward him, brushing her fingers against his arm as if to remind him he wasn't invisible. He gently placed her hand back on her chest, right over the cloth, helping her keep pressure on her wound while he used his free hand to wrap his arm with what was left of his shirt. The sun was higher now, casting longer shadows across the field. The warmth of the day felt wrong against the chill that hung around them. Clara's breathing was still shallow but steady. Ethan stayed close, watching her face carefully, ready to act if she showed any sign of fading. Every minute felt like an hour. He knew they couldn't stay here much longer. She needed more care than he could give on the ground. But he also knew moving her too soon might make things worse, so he kept talking to her in a low voice, telling her small stories about the horses, the ranch, anything that might keep her awake. "Do you remember the chestnut mare you fed yesterday?" he said softly. "The one that kept trying to steal the carrots from your pocket?" A faint smile appeared on Clara's lips, weak but real. "Yeah," she whispered faintly. "She's probably waiting for you to bring her more carrots," he said gently. "You still have a lot of work to do, Clara, so don't you dare fall asleep now." Her fingers twitched against the cloth as she held it to her wound. She blinked slowly, fighting to stay awake. Ethan's vision blurred slightly from the pain in his own arm, but he pushed it aside. He had to stay strong for her. She trusted him. He couldn't let her down. His arm throbbed, warm blood seeping through the makeshift bandage, but he didn't even look at it anymore. All his focus was on keeping her breathing steady and keeping hope alive in her eyes. Far in the distance, the sound of a horse neighing reached his ears. It was faint, but it meant help might be coming. Maybe one of the neighbors had seen something. Maybe someone would arrive in time to help get her to the doctor. But even if no one came, Ethan was ready to do whatever it took. Clara had given him her trust. That meant something. That meant everything. He reached down and gently squeezed her hand. "You're going to be all right," he whispered, his voice steady even though his body ached. "We're both going to be all right." And as the morning turned into late noon, Clara lay there fighting for every breath, and Ethan stayed beside her, ready to fight for both of them. Their world had narrowed down to a patch of dusty ground, one arrow, two beating hearts, and a bond that neither of them had expected, but both of them now depended on. The arrow lay on the ground, dark and heavy with the morning's pain. Clara stared at it for a long time, even though her vision kept fading in and out. Her body was trembling, but she didn't know if it was from the cold, the blood loss, or the fear still gripping her chest. Each breath felt like she was pulling air through a narrow straw. It hurt, but she was still breathing, and that meant she was still fighting. Ethan stayed crouched beside her, his hand firm on the bandage pressed against her wound. His other arm, wrapped with what little cloth he had left, was starting to throb more now. He had ignored it at first, but the pain was growing. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to breathe slowly. He couldn't let her see him falter. She needed him steady. Her eyes flicked toward him weakly. She was pale, her lashes damp with tears, but there was still a spark of awareness in her gaze. She whispered, barely audible, "You're hurt too." He shook his head, his voice low and rough but steady. "It's nothing, Clara, don't you worry about me." But deep down, he knew his arm was bleeding more than he'd admitted. When he had pulled the arrow from her chest, the sharp edge had sliced through the muscle of his forearm. It wasn't a shallow scratch. Warm blood had soaked through the cloth and was now dripping slowly into the dirt. He shifted slightly, hiding the worst of it from her. He didn't want fear in her eyes. She had enough pain of her own to carry. The sun now stood high overhead, no longer gentle. It burned down on the open pasture, making the air dry and the dust rise around them. Clara's breathing grew uneven again, and panic flashed through Ethan's chest like a spark catching dry wood. He leaned closer, brushing the hair from her face with his good hand. Her skin was cold. "Stay with me," he whispered firmly. "Don't close your eyes. Look at me." She blinked slowly, struggling to keep her gaze locked on his. Her lips parted, trying to speak, but only soft gasps came out. He gave her a small, calm smile, even though his own strength was slipping. "You're doing good," he said softly. "Just keep breathing. You're stronger than you think." But then a wave of dizziness hit him hard. The world tilted slightly, and for the first time he felt his knees wobble. He caught himself quickly before she noticed. His hand pressed harder on her bandage, trying to stop the blood. His arm burned with pain, but he forced his focus on her. Clara felt the shift. She wasn't fully aware of everything, but she could sense something was wrong. She could feel the slight shake in his hand, the uneven weight in his touch. Her hand, weak and trembling, moved toward his injured arm. Her fingers brushed against the soaked fabric, and she felt the warm stickiness of blood. She whispered, "You're bleeding more than me." Her words were barely a breath, but they pierced him more deeply than the pain in his arm. He looked down at her hand resting on his arm. She was lying there wounded, yet still worried about him. He didn't know whether to smile or to shout in frustration at how unfair this moment was. Ethan gently lifted her hand off his wound and placed it back against her chest. "No," he said softly but firmly. "You're the one who needs saving. I can take a little pain. You just keep breathing, all right?" The wind picked up again, rustling the dry grass. In the distance, a crow cried. The ranch, usually alive with simple sounds of work, felt quiet and hollow. Every second felt longer than it should have been. Ethan glanced at the horizon. No sign of help yet. No riders, no wagons, no neighbors. Just empty land and a road that stretched too far. He knew they couldn't stay like this. Clara was getting weaker, and so was he. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had to move her. He knew it would hurt her, maybe even make things worse, but doing nothing would be far worse. He bent closer to her and whispered, "Clara, I need to get you to the house. It's the only way. If we stay here, we won't make it. Do you trust me?" Her eyes opened slowly, cloudy but still searching for his, and then, barely moving her lips, she said, "Yes." He nodded once, a small but determined motion. He braced his good arm under her back gently. Even that tiny movement made her gasp sharply, pain flashing across her face. He froze immediately, whispering, "I'm sorry. I know it hurts, but we have to do this." She gripped his shirt weakly, not to stop him, but to hold on to something. She was scared, but she trusted him. The trust gave him strength he didn't think he still had. Using every ounce of control, Ethan carefully slid one arm beneath her legs and the other under her shoulders. As soon as he lifted, Clara let out a trembling cry, her body arching against his chest. The pain from her wound sent shivers through her entire body, but she didn't push him away. She buried her face against his chest, tears spilling down. "I've got you," he whispered again over and over like a quiet promise. "I've got you." Each step he took across the field felt longer than a mile. The weight in his arms wasn't just her body. It was the responsibility of keeping her alive. His own arm ached sharply with every step. Blood dripped steadily from his bandage, staining the earth behind them. But he didn't stop. Clara's breath was warm against his shirt, short and shallow. Her heartbeat was faint, but he could feel it, and that faint beat was enough to keep him walking. He talked softly as he carried her, not because she needed the words to understand, but because she needed the sound to keep her from drifting away. "You're going to see the doctor," he murmured, his voice steady even as his body screamed with pain. "You're going to be just fine. Do you hear me? Just fine." The ranch house came into view, small but strong, standing against the open sky. It wasn't far now, but each step burned. His vision blurred once and he almost stumbled, but he tightened his grip on her. He could not fall. Not now. By the time he reached the porch, his breaths were deep and rough. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and lowered her gently onto the couch near the fireplace. She winced, her hand still gripping the bandage at her chest. Her skin was clammy, but she was still conscious. That gave him hope. Ethan's arm throbbed badly now. Blood had soaked through the makeshift wrapping. But he didn't care about treating it yet. He grabbed a fresh cloth, tied it tighter around her wound, and poured water over it to keep it clean. She whimpered softly, but her eyes stayed open. "You're safe now," he said quietly, brushing her hair back again. "You're in the house. We're almost there." His hands moved quickly, almost instinctively. He stoked the fire to warm the room, then grabbed the old rope bell that hung by the door. He pulled it hard, once, twice, 3 times. The bell's echo rang across the open ranch, a sound every neighbor in miles would recognize as a call for help. He went back to her side, kneeling beside the couch. She was shivering slightly despite the warmth of the fire. Her breathing was still too shallow. He leaned close so she could hear him clearly. "Clara, help is coming. You've got to hold on, all right?" Her lips moved weakly. "You're bleeding too," she whispered again. Even in pain, her eyes kept flicking toward his injured arm. He gave a small, tired laugh, though it came out shaky. "I'll let the doctor yell at me later. Right now it's you I care about." Her eyes softened, and for a brief second a faint smile appeared through the pain. It was weak, but it was real. That small smile hit Ethan like a warm light in a dark room. It reminded him why he wasn't giving up. His vision blurred for a moment as he sat back against the floorboards, exhaustion creeping up his spine. But he shook it off. This wasn't the time to rest. He needed to stay awake, stay alert. Outside, the bell's echo slowly faded. Then faintly came the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. It was faint at first, almost like a trick of the wind. But then it grew louder. Someone had heard the signal. Someone was coming. Ethan forced himself to stand again, swaying a little from the loss of blood. He walked to the door, his hand gripping the frame to steady himself. Clara's eyes followed him weakly, the soft sound of hooves growing clearer. The sound of approaching riders was a promise. Help was close. But both of them were already at their breaking point. Clara lay there, her hand still pressing weakly on the wound at her chest. Ethan stood in the doorway, blood soaking his arm, swaying slightly, refusing to sit down. This was the breaking point. The hardest part wasn't over yet, but the sound of horses meant they had a chance. And sometimes in moments like this, a single chance was all it took to keep two people from slipping away. He turned his head back to Clara and said softly, "Hold on. Just a little longer. We're not done yet." And as the riders came closer, their hearts, two tired, bleeding hearts, kept beating in the same stubborn rhythm, refusing to give up. The sound of hooves echoed louder and louder, breaking the long stillness that had held the ranch since morning. Dust rose on the road leading to the house, curling like soft smoke under the midday sun. Ethan leaned against the doorway, his injured arm pressed tightly against his side, his breathing uneven but steady. His eyes stayed fixed on Clara, lying pale and weak on the couch, her chest rising and falling slowly beneath the tight bandage. Her eyes fluttered open every few seconds, as if she was fighting to stay in the world. She looked fragile, so fragile it made his chest ache, but there was still a flicker of determination inside her. She was still holding on. That was all he needed to keep standing. The horses finally came into view. Two neighbors rode up, Tom and his wife Marlene. They were both older ranch folk who had known Ethan since he was a young man. They jumped off their horses before the animals even stopped moving and hurried toward the porch. Tom's face hardened the moment he saw the blood on Ethan's arm and the pale figure of Clara on the couch. "Good Lord, Ethan," he said in a deep, steady voice. "What happened here?" "Arrow," Ethan said simply, his voice rough from exhaustion. "She's been hit. Lost a lot of blood. I pulled it out. She's still breathing, but—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. Marlene rushed to Clara's side. Her hands were gentle but quick, like someone who had done this kind of thing before. She pressed a fresh cloth over the wound, checking the bandage Ethan had tied earlier. "She's weak, but she's still with us," Marlene said softly. She brushed Clara's hair away from her damp forehead and whispered, "You hold on, sweetheart. Help's here." Tom grabbed the saddlebag from his horse and came inside with a small bottle of clear liquid and some clean cloth. He knelt next to Ethan and took one look at his arm. "And what about you, boy?" Ethan shook his head. "She's worse. Take care of her first," Tom didn't argue. He knew Ethan well enough to recognize that stubborn tone. Instead, he barked, "Marlene, keep pressure on that wound. I'll get Doc Baker here." He hurried back out to his horse, mounted in one smooth movement, and rode off toward the town as fast as the horse could run. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of Clara's weak breaths and the soft crackle of the fire. Inside the house, Marlene moved quickly. She kept talking to Clara in a calm, steady voice. "You're going to be all right, sweetheart. Doc Baker's on his way. You're strong, I can tell. Just keep breathing. That's it, good girl." Ethan knelt down beside the couch, his arm throbbing more now, but he pushed the pain down. He gently held Clara's hand. It was cold, but still had a faint grip. He looked into her tired eyes and whispered, "See? I told you someone would come. Just a little longer." Her lips moved slowly and a shaky sound came out. "Thank you." He squeezed her hand lightly. "Don't thank me yet. You've still got a fight ahead of you." Marlene glanced up at Ethan's arm and frowned. "You're losing blood too. Sit down before you fall down, boy." "I'm fine," Ethan said, even though he wasn't. His legs felt like wood, his shirt was soaked through, and his head was light. But he stayed where he was, right beside Clara. Minutes felt like hours. The room was quiet except for the creak of the wooden floor and Clara's uneven breaths. Ethan watched her chest rise and fall, each breath like a small victory. He spoke softly every few minutes, telling her stories about the horses, the creek behind the barn, the way the sun hit the mountains in winter. Anything to keep her anchored in the world. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound of hooves returned. Tom burst through the door with an older man in a dark coat carrying a leather medical bag. Doc Baker had been the town doctor for 30 years, and his steady hands had saved more lives than anyone could count. He didn't waste a second. He set his bag on the floor, knelt beside Clara, and carefully peeled back the bandage Ethan had tied. His experienced eyes scanned the wound, his brow tightening. "You did good, Ethan," he said without looking up. "If you hadn't pulled it when you did, she wouldn't still be breathing. But she's still in danger. She's lost a lot of blood." Ethan swallowed hard. He knew that already, but hearing it out loud felt heavier. Doc Baker cleaned the wound with practiced hands, murmuring quiet instructions to Marlene, who handed him everything he needed before he even asked. Clara whimpered softly as he worked, but he spoke to her gently. "I know it hurts, sweetheart, but you're going to be all right. We're going to patch you up." Ethan held her hand through it, whispering small things to distract her, telling her to focus on his voice. Her eyes flickered between his face and the ceiling, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Once the doctor finished stitching and cleaning the wound, he wrapped it with clean bandages and covered it with a soft cloth. Clara was weak, but she was still breathing. That was what mattered. Then Doc Baker turned his eyes to Ethan. "And now you," he said firmly. Ethan tried to wave him off, but Marlene crossed her arms with that look only someone like her could give. "Don't argue, boy. You're no good to anyone if you fall over." Ethan finally sat down on the floor, his back against the wall. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was fading fast, and the pain in his arm was sharper now. Doc Baker knelt beside him, carefully unwrapping the soaked fabric. The wound was deep but not dangerous if treated quickly. The doctor cleaned and wrapped it with fresh bandages, his movements firm but careful. "You're lucky it didn't cut an artery," the doctor said as he tightened the bandage. "Another inch and you'd both be in real trouble." Ethan exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized just how close it had been. The room slowly filled with a different kind of silence, a heavy but calmer one. Clara lay resting on the couch, her breathing steadier now. Marlene placed a damp cloth on her forehead and whispered soft, reassuring words. Ethan sat nearby, his arm cleanly bandaged, his shirt stained and torn, but the wild panic of earlier had started to ease. Tom came back inside after tying up the horses and stood quietly by the door. "Baker says she'll make it?" he asked softly. Doc Baker nodded. "If she rests, stays warm, and doesn't get any infection, she's got a good chance. She's a tough girl." He looked at Ethan. "And she's got a stubborn fool watching over her. That helps too." A tired smile flickered across Ethan's face for the first time all day. His shoulders loosened a little. The weight he'd been carrying since morning finally shifted. Hours passed slowly. The fire crackled gently, filling the house with a soft warmth. Clara stirred a few times, her eyes opening halfway. Every time she did, Ethan was there, holding her hand, whispering that she was safe. Marlene and Tom stayed too, refusing to leave until they were sure everything was stable. As the sky outside began to turn orange with the setting sun, Clara blinked, fully awake. Her throat was dry, but her voice came out in a whisper. "Ethan, you stayed?" He gave a quiet laugh, though his voice was still tired. "Of course I stayed. Where else would I go?" She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes glassy but clear. Then a single tear rolled down her cheek. Not from pain this time, but from something softer, something grateful. She whispered, "You saved me." He shook his head slowly. "No, Clara, you fought for your life. I just didn't let go of you." Tom and Marlene exchanged a quiet glance near the door, but said nothing. Doc Baker packed up his things, satisfied for now. The danger wasn't fully gone. She would still need rest and care, but the worst had passed. Ethan leaned closer, brushing the hair away from Clara's forehead gently. For the first time since that terrible moment in the pasture, he allowed himself to exhale without fear. The wind outside was calm now, no longer carrying panic with it. The stars would soon appear in the night sky. But inside the small ranch house there was a soft glow of firelight, the steady breathing of two people who had survived something they hadn't expected to face together. And in that quiet warmth, surrounded by friends who had rushed to help, something changed between Ethan and Clara. It wasn't spoken out loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the way their hands stayed close, in the way their eyes lingered a little longer than before. She had cried when he pulled the arrow from her chest. She had feared it was the end. But now she lay there breathing, safe because he had refused to give up, and in that quiet evening, When the world finally exhaled with them, they both knew their lives had just become tied in a way neither of them could fully explain yet. Ethan didn't need thanks. Seeing her alive was enough. And Clara didn't need to say more. Just a faint squeeze of his hand was enough to speak 1,000 quiet words. The night after the accident was the longest night of Ethan's life. The fire burned softly in the hearth, its warm glow spreading across the wooden walls of the ranch house. Outside, the sky was full of stars. The wind had calmed down and the horses were quiet in the stable. But inside, every sound seemed louder. Clara's slow breathing, the crackle of the fire, and Ethan's heartbeat pounding like a steady drum. He sat in the wooden chair beside the couch, his injured arm wrapped in fresh bandages. His shirt was still torn and stained, but he didn't care. His eyes never left Clara. She lay there wrapped in a blanket, her skin still pale but warmer than before. Her breaths were slow, a little stronger than earlier. The bandages on her chest were clean now, carefully wrapped by the doctor before he left. Doc Baker had told Ethan that the next 24 hours were the most important. Clara had survived the bleeding, but her body was weak. She needed rest, warmth, and care. Infection was a danger, but if she stayed strong, she would heal. Ethan took those words seriously. He didn't move far from her side all night. Marlene had left some extra bandages and hot broth on the kitchen table before she and Tom rode home. They had promised to come back in the morning to check on both of them. The house was quiet now, except for the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands folded together. He was tired, more tired than he'd ever been. His arm throbbed, but it was nothing compared to what Clara had endured. Every few minutes he reached out to touch her wrist gently, just to make sure her pulse was still there. Every time he felt that tiny heartbeat under his fingertips, a wave of relief washed over him. Clara stirred a little in her sleep. Her face was soft now, not twisted in pain like before. For the first time since that terrible moment in the pasture, Ethan allowed himself to breathe slowly. The image of her collapsing on the ground, the arrow in her chest, still burned in his mind. But now when he looked at her, he didn't see fear. He saw hope. Sometime after midnight, Clara's eyes opened slowly. The room was dim except for the firelight, and her vision was blurry at first. She turned her head slightly and saw Ethan sitting there, still awake. "Ethan," she whispered weakly. Her voice was hoarse but gentle. He leaned closer immediately. "I'm here," he said softly. "How do you feel?" She took a shaky breath. "Like I got run over by a horse." He let out a quiet laugh, the first real laugh he'd had in what felt like forever. "Well, I'd say that's fair. You've been through a lot today." Her eyes shifted down to his bandaged arm. She frowned softly. "And you've been bleeding too." He shook his head. "It's nothing compared to what you went through. I'm just glad you're still here." Her gaze softened. "I thought I was going to die out there," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He remembered the exact moment when he'd thought the same thing, when her skin had gone pale in the field, and her breathing had slowed so much he could barely feel it. His chest tightened just thinking about it. He leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "I wasn't going to let that happen." For a long moment, the two of them said nothing. The only sound in the room was the steady rhythm of the fire. Clara's hand, still weak, slid out from beneath the blanket. Ethan instinctively reached out and held it, careful and gentle. Her hand was warm now. She looked at their hands and whispered, "Why did you stay with me?" Ethan gave a small, tired smile. "Because no one deserves to fight alone, especially not someone who's been working so hard on this ranch." Her eyes filled with quiet emotion. She wasn't used to people standing by her side. She had come to the ranch looking for a fresh start, never expecting to find someone who would risk his own safety to keep her alive. "I thought I'd be alone forever," she said softly. Ethan's voice was calm but sure. "Not anymore." The night grew deeper, and eventually Clara drifted back into sleep. Ethan sat back, watching her chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm. He knew she wasn't fully out of danger yet, but this felt different now. This wasn't a fight against death anymore. It was the slow, quiet climb back toward life. In the early morning hours, the first light of dawn slipped through the window. It painted the room in soft gold. Clara was still asleep, but her breathing was stronger now. Ethan stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the cool air. The pasture stretched out in front of him, quiet and calm. as if yesterday's chaos had never happened. But he knew it had, and he knew things wouldn't be the same again. Tom and Marlene arrived just after sunrise, bringing warm bread, fresh water, and more clean cloth. Marlene walked straight to Clara's side, gently checking her temperature and pulse. "She's holding strong," Marlene said with a satisfied smile. "She's a fighter." Tom clapped Ethan lightly on the good shoulder. "You did good, son. You both did." Ethan nodded, though his tired eyes said everything words couldn't. Over the next few days, Clara began to heal slowly. Every morning, Ethan helped her sit up, supported her as she took small sips of broth, and made sure the bandages stayed clean. She was weak, but she was determined. Each small step, sitting a little longer, speaking a little clearer, breathing a little easier, was a victory. At night, Ethan always stayed nearby, sometimes in the chair, sometimes leaning against the wall, listening to the sound of her breathing. He found peace in knowing she was alive, that they had both made it through something that could have ended very differently. One afternoon, about a week later, Clara walked a few slow steps to the porch with Ethan's help. The sun was warm on her face, and the breeze smelled like fresh grass and horses. She closed her eyes and smiled faintly. "I never thought I'd see this again," she said softly. Ethan stood beside her, his arm still in a sling but healing. "You're stronger than you think," he replied. "You proved that out there." She turned to look at him. The sunlight caught her hair, making it shine softly. There was still tiredness in her eyes, but also something brighter, something alive. "I wouldn't have made it without you," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "You fought every step of the way. I just held on to you." For a moment, silence settled between them, not heavy like before, but warm. They didn't need grand speeches or perfect words. They understood each other in a way only people who had survived something together could. As the weeks passed, Clara grew stronger. The wound on her chest healed slowly, leaving a small scar that she sometimes touched without even realizing it. Ethan's arm healed too, leaving its own thin scar. But neither of them minded the marks. They were proof. Quiet reminders of a day when everything had changed. Neighbors who heard the story would nod and shake their heads in disbelief. They said it was a miracle she survived, and that the rancher had shown the kind of courage people talk about for years. Ethan never saw himself as a hero. He had just done what his heart told him to do. Clara never forgot that moment when she had opened her eyes on the field and saw him above her, refusing to leave. She had cried when he pulled the iron arrow from her chest, but what stayed in her heart was not the pain. It was the look in his eyes. Calm, steady, unshakable. Sometimes, late in the evening, they would sit on the porch together in silence, watching the stars. No words were needed. Their bond had been formed not through promises, but through a shared storm they had survived. The ranch carried on, as it always did. Fences still needed mending, horses still needed feeding, and the sun still rose and set over the wide land. But for Ethan and Clara, the world felt different now, softer, stronger. One evening, as the sky turned pink and gold, Clara leaned back in her chair, her hand resting over the place where the arrow had once struck. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I thought that moment was the end. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of something." Ethan turned his head slightly toward her, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah," he said softly. "It was." And as the breeze moved gently through the tall grass and the horses shifted lazily in the field, two people who had nearly lost everything now sat side by side, alive and breathing. What had started with fear, pain, and blood had turned into something quiet and powerful. A bond built not on words, but on courage, trust, and the unshakable will to hold on. The scars they carried would fade with time, but the memory of that day would never leave them. It had written itself into their lives like a promise that sometimes, even when the world turns dark and everything seems lost, two hearts can fight their way back to the light together. Ethan glanced at Clara, and she met his gaze with a soft smile, the kind of smile that said everything without a single word. They had both survived, and that was enough.